Actually, there's a question about Ken Cooper and about who was his position was general manager, right? Or I forget.
Yes.
Yeah, and his relationship with Lochner and how that influenced the coverage. I mean, again, that's one of those complex inner workings of a news organization. But in brief, and how would you characterize Cooper's stance on these issues?
On the journalistic issues, or
Yeah, well, yeah, on how the Bureau should handle these,
yeah,
these very touchy issues. And Randy, your point about UP having the reputation of being sensationalistic, but remember also a lot of people initially rejected stories about the Holocaust and so forth, saying it couldn't be true. And on a rational level, it felt too absurd and too horrific to be true. And that happened in Britain and the US. And so the boundary between sensationalistic and just accurate in this case was often very thin.
yeah. So that relationship between Cooper and Lochner is really, really interesting. And thank goodness there was no internet and email then, because these guys wrote long, long letters back and forth to each other. And Cooper was a huge figure in American journalism, also controversial. He was an isolationist, certainly for a lot of the early part of the war. Um, and he was full of wonderful rhetoric about, journalism and democracy, and the Associated Press bringing the truth to the world. He was trying to expand AP as a business, and he used this kind of rhetoric in doing that. But the sense that I got was basically he was a businessman at heart, and Lochner understood that. And so Lochner, in making his argument, that it's more important for us to stay in the field than take risks and get thrown out, he was always throwing that back to Cooper. Like if we on the first photo that Randy showed, the lawyer being marched around with his pants cut off and he's been beaten up and stuff, and Lochner didn't buy that photo. And so Hearst bought it and it ran in the Hearst papers. And you can imagine the photo editors in New York are apoplectic, and they send this rocket message to Lochner. And he responds and he says, "You should be darn glad we didn't buy that, because we'd be out of business today, if we had bought that picture and run it in America." And you hear that over and over from him, and he knows that resonates with Cooper, and will keep Cooper backing him up. Yes, they do need to self-censor. It's okay. Calm down, everybody. Leave their copy alone. There's some story got changed with when Lochner had buried a lead way down in a story. They moved it up, and he angrily writes to New York and says, "You can't do that. You're putting us in jeopardy." And Cooper, of course, backed him all the way and basically said, "Don't touch their copy." If they buried the lead, they had a good reason for doing it.
Yeah, there's actually a question here about editors in New York and the AP being whether they were skeptical about the Bureau's reports. But here it's actually the opposite syndrome that you're talking about, where they're trying to play up the more, let's say, colorful and damning evidence. And there's also a question here from Bill Holstein about the use of Jewish sources by correspondents, by the AP correspondents. Randy?
Okay, I'd like to take that question.
Sure.
So as far as within AP, I'm not familiar that AP had Jewish correspondents here. Okay, he's talking about American Jewish correspondents.
Well, there are two questions I think that came through, if I read them right. One was, were there American Jewish correspondents there still? There certainly were in the 20s, and they're in the AP Bureau. And then Jewish sources for AP reporters.
Okay, so the Jewish correspondents that were there were represented by the Jewish Telegraphic Agency. That was the like the AP for Jewish newspapers. I believe like Harry Smaller was based there in the 30s. Unfortunately, I feel it was a mistake. AP had terminated its agreement with the JTA. I think the JTA was reporting a lot of what was happening during the Holocaust, and I feel that, well, it wasn't only AP, but the New York Times also um, discontinued its coverage with JTA. AP discontinued its coverage because they did a survey among bureau chiefs, and they felt that they were getting the news without the JTA. They were getting the same news. But I feel that on a daily basis, one can see all the beyond relief tales that were coming out. And if you triangulate these things from many sources, like, then it becomes hard not to believe that these things were happening. So unfortunately, AP didn't subscribe to JTA at the time. And one of the aggressive things that the JTA did, and we write about this in the book, that when the journalists were interned in 42, the military attaché had them conduct a survey, a questionnaire of how to conduct propaganda against the Germans, and they said not to talk about the Jewish question, that that wouldn't be good. So the JTA saw this, that there was resistance within the general media. So what they did was very clever. They created an alternative, non-Jewish facing news service called the Overseas News Service. They hired non-Jewish employees, respectable writers too, who wrote about these issues that the JTA was writing about, but wasn't getting any traction in the general media. But when the Overseas News Agency would write about it, for instance, they reported that there was a massacre, the Baba Yar, one of the biggest massacres of Jews. So they wrote an early story on it. And because it came from the Overseas News Agency, the Boston Globe picked that up. So that it's
I
so
just want to get back also to
yes,
the question. I'm not sure we answered it, about Jewish employees in the Bureau. There were Jewish employees in the photo operation at first, but they were, as you explain in the book, were all were dismissed, had to be let go. That was demanded by the Nazi regime. The AP did dismiss them, but as you also point out, it was still early enough. They seem to have gotten most of them out and jobs elsewhere. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and there's an important distinction. So there were two AP entities there. One was the News Bureau, which was just kind of a classic foreign bureau, and then the photo operation, which was actually a German registered company. And so that was subject to all of these German laws, the anti-Semitic German laws that were being passed. And so when they said, German media cannot have any Jewish employees, they'd applied to the AP photo operation. And Lochner has described, fighting that for a while and saying, oh, but I really need these people. They're essential to our operation. But, eventually he had to cave in. People were let go. He says that he helped some of them get to the United States. And Randy, you know the precise numbers here. They all got out of Germany, but not necessarily to safety. Willie Jacobson, for example.
So there were 6 of them total. One of them was transferred to Paris. Jacobson wasn't allowed to work in Germany anymore, so AP sent him to work in the Austria bureau until the Germans came in 38 and then locked him up with no reason. Then the AP sent him outside the German Reich to Czechoslovakia, uh, um, to which the Germans then invaded, and then he went back to Berlin. One interesting thing in the book was we're not aware that he was a Kristallnacht photographer. We don't know what happened to him when he got back to Berlin after he came back from Czechoslovakia in 38. But one of the fascinating captions on the back of one of the Kristallnacht photos is like his initial on there. They would put the AP initials of the photographers, and there was only one Kristallnacht photograph that had an initial, which was J, which was on all his other photographs that he did from in Berlin and Vienna. So it's interesting to think if he came out the night of Kristallnacht to snap some photos.
Yeah.
But
All six of them survived the war.
yeah,
And I think
but-
that the five you pretty much knew, but then Willie Jacobson was the one that it took a lot of research to find out, because he was in East Germany after the war.
Right.
So limited contact with him. But Randy finally found, the traces and uncovered, he had a photo agency there, and he resumed a career, but in East Germany. And he had a little bit of contact with at least one former AP employee during that period.
Mhm.
Would-
And
Go ahead.
so
Yeah.
the former Jewish employees, Leon Daniel and Alfred Eisenstadt, created the Pix photo agency when they left AP and came to America in 35. The Pix agency hired refugees, but AP also used them as a source to counteract Nazi propaganda. Like, for instance, Franz Roth painted a varnished version of the Nazi occupation of France getting back to normal. But then AP countered that with photos from Pix, the agency with former Jewish employees of AP, that counted the varnished version of France. And that must have given satisfaction to these Jewish employees that AP was publishing their photos. I think that's an interesting side story.